Well, good afternoon, and welcome to my video on the archetypes and myths of the sign of Gemini. My name is Sean Klinkner, and I am a practicing astrologer and the founder of WisdomTree Astrology. Today, we're going to be exploring the archetypes and myths of the second sign of the planet Mercury, the air sign of Gemini. This is my second video in my series on the archetypes and myths of the zodiac, and you can find the first video on the sign of Virgo here on the WisdomTree YouTube channel. Don't miss it. Before we go further, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Your support means a lot to me, and it helps me get my teaching and practice seen by others. Now, without further ado, let's dive in. Before we get started, I want to offer some special thanks to some of the astrologers who have both taught me and inspire me. Adam Ellenboss is my teacher and mentor at Nightlight Astrology. And if any of you are interested in studying astrology and practicing it or just learning about it, I would highly recommend Nightlight's school, Astrology for the Modern Mystic. It is a fantastic way of learning the deep history and the art of astrology, and I would highly recommend it to you. Liz Green is also another well-known author of multiple books, and she in particular has been recognized for her research into the myths of astrology, from which some of my research on this topic today has been derived from. I'd also like to highlight and celebrate the work of Bernadette Brady, who's a fantastic astrologer and author of the book Brady's Books of Fixed Stars. And also Austin Coppock, another well-known contemporary astrologer and author of 36 Faces, a book on the decans of astrology. Lastly, I want to give some special recognition to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I think I said that right. I apologize if I didn't say that right. From whom they have a wonderful myth and a beautiful cosmology that I will be sharing today in the context of our time together, exploring the myths of Gemini. It goes without saying that none of us who are practicing astrologers do this work on our own. We stand on the shoulders of generations of astrologers who come before us. And so I really want to be sincere in my recognition and thanks for these folks who have paved the way for us to understand the amazing things that are a part of the zodiac and the study and practice of astrology. So thank you. Oops. So let's get started with understanding a little bit about the sign of Gemini. Gemini, as I mentioned, is the zodiac sign of Mercury, which occurs in the late spring up until the time of the summer solstice. It's a masculine, mutable air sign, meaning that it has an expressive, initiatory quality to it. It's double-bodied or mutable, which means that it comes at a time when seasons are transitioning. It contains both the fixed energy of springtime and the transitional or initiatory of energy of summer. It typically falls annually between May 20th and June 20th, leading up to the summer solstice, and it is the last sign of spring. One of the things that I want to talk about and illustrate is some of the astronomical significance of the sign. And in order for us to understand that, we want to take some time to look at the arc of the sun through the solar year. The point at which the sun reaches the culmination of its journey is the moment of the summer solstice. It's at the point where it is highest in the sky and it is moving up towards the Tropic of Cancer where it peaks at the ecliptic, and then it begins to turn around and begin its descent back towards the celestial equator. Gemini season, therefore, is that period of time where the sun is preparing to culminate, reach its highest point, and then begin the descent downwards back towards darkness. This is really important for how we begin to understand and think about the sign of Gemini. It is the culmination of light and also the descent the very early descent into the days of darkness and the lessening of the days of the sun. Note that the celestial equator is the time of the year where we experience equal day and equal night, or the equinoxes. Similarly, in Capricorn season, just to give you an anchor point, it is when the sun is lowest in the sky, and it's at its point in the solar journey where it is the southernmost, and it begins to hit that bottom of the pole star um, axis, and it begins to turn around and climb, and the days of light are increasing. So it's just a good way for us to think about that context as it relates to our understanding, not just the sign of Gemini, but any of the signs in the time of year that they take place. Now, one of the things that I want to anchor us in as we go along is I want to help us get a really good foundation in understanding the nature of Mercury. And to do that, I want to spend some time talking about the Thema Mundi. The Thema Mundi was a teaching chart or a tool that ancient astrologers used to educate their students in the nature of the signs. Now, I don't have all of the signs shown here, but what you will see is you will see the moon in its sign of Cancer, the sun in its sign of Leo, and Mercury in its two signs, Virgo and Gemini, not Germany. Oh my goodness. Um, and I think here is where it's important to recognize that this tool was used to help teach students about planetary dignities, the nature of planets and their contrarieties, and also the aspect theme. You'll hear astrologers talk about things like oppositions, squares, sextiles, and trines. All of those aspects are embedded here in the Thema Mundi. Well, what's interesting about the signs of Mercury is that they are both complementary and in aversion to the sun and the moon. Gemini, Mercury's air sign, was compatible with the sun's fiery nature and in its position in Leo. But Gemini is an aversion to the sign of Cancer, the sign of the moon. Similarly, the sign of Virgo, which is an earth sign, was compatible with the moon's water sign, but it was an aversion to the sign of Leo, a fire sign. Aversion in astrology indicates a blind spot, a place where planets can't witness to one another. And in this case, we can see something about the signs of Mercury being sometimes in a complementary or supporting kind of a role, and sometimes operating in a blind spot or a vacuum. In this case, this is where we derive some of the understanding of Mercury as a bit of a trickster, sometimes quirky, sometimes a little bit of a rebellion type personality. Also, there's something here to be understood about where Mercury can operate a little bit sometimes as an agent of chaos. Some of this is in both of Mercury's signs, and it's going to be fun to explore that today. So, in my research and development of this material, I have been working to try and gather some of the amazing myths and archetypes that I feel like have spoken really well to the diversity in Gemini. It's really important for me to mention here that Gemini is a very diverse sign, and that each of the archetypes that I'm going to be exploring today and the ones that I've named represent creative ways that I've attempted to kind of organize or package several sub archetypes, which many might readily ascribe to this very, very amazing sign of Mercury. The archetypes that I did develop here are in no way intended to limit the depth of this sign. They're just intended to help us connect with some of the core qualities that I see being very prominent with this sign of Gemini. And so the way I have grouped them is the way that I see them being somewhat related to one another. And so you might see them differently or might see more in a relation, and I think that that's perfectly fine. The four archetypes that I'm going to be reviewing with you today are the Visioneer, the Bard, the Competitor, and the Duelist. There's nothing super fancy about these names. They're just ways that I found to kind of capture some of the spirit and the core essence of how I see some of these archetypal qualities of the sign of Gemini within a concept. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some of the mythology and the characteristics that I associate with each of these archetypes in our time together today. Hopefully, by the time that we're finished, you will have a much deeper and perhaps more profound appreciation for just how diverse the sign of Gemini is. Let's start with the Visioneer. So, the Visioneer includes a variety of sub archetypes that reflect the creative neuroplasticity and genius of the sign of Gemini. Gemini as a sign expresses the ability to learn and consume information, kind of understand the laws of the universe, and challenge those same laws to pioneer new ideas. Because of the astronomical quality of the season of Gemini, there is this understanding of the whole, which is kind of that idea of the sun reaching its point and culminating in the sky and then beginning its descent, is the idea of breaking that whole down into component parts. In the same way, we want to think about how sometimes with this archetype, the Visioneer, it is those ideas which originate in the mind of the divine or the universe or the ethereal space descending into bodily form and materiality, that is kind of a part of the framework of this archetype. It is why that we see sub-archetypes belonging to the Visioneer, like the inventor, the artist, or the magician. These are concepts that are synonymous with people who think things, or there's ideas that they have that reflect something that is powerful, creative, or bringing together multiple things that are relatively different and combining them in new ways to bring about something manifest in the world. That's why I actually have the Magician Tarot card here, because the Magician in the Tarot is this archetype in the present of the Tarot that's present in the Tarot that brings things out of the four elements: air, earth, water, and fire, and combines them in unique ways to bring about something alchemical or bring something into manifestation. In this way, the archetype of the Visioneer feels compelled to explore bringing ideas into reality. They are very experimental. Instead of looking at all the ways that things are different and saying, well, there's no way we could combine these, they actually dare to ask the question, why not? How could this be possible? They are quintessential dabblers. And that's why you'll see things like the alchemist or the magician or the artist or the inventor that brings unlikely things and combinations together to create something that's unique and innovative. It's also really important here to understand that a deep foundation of this archetype is the embedded curiosity, the desire to explore, the urgency to learn or to figure things out and to understand things both in their core nature and their individual components, and also how they relate to the greater whole. So let's dive into this a little bit more and think about how this relates to the actual myths and the stories behind the sign of Gemini. So some of the significance of this archetype is actually derived from the first decan of astrology, which was called the Apple of Eden. The decans, or the faces, are sections of each sign. Each sign is comprised of 30 degrees, and each decan, therefore, is divided into thirds and allotted 10 degrees and is given kind of a planetary ruler within the sign. That might feel a little bit confusing. I wouldn't worry about it too much right now in understanding that. But what I would like you to focus on is let's get into the story behind this archetype of the apple of Eden. So, in the first decan of Gemini, we see qualities of the innocent or the virgin mind that becomes open to knowledge by having eaten from the apple of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. This exposure to knowledge is very, very symbolic of the understanding of both the light side of existence and the dark side of existence. Here is where we first begin to look at some of the polarity that is contained in the sign of Gemini. The gifts of this decan include great intelligence, curiosity, inventiveness, sound familiar, and the thirst to gain knowledge, the thirst to experiment and to know many things. Now, one of the things that I thought of when I came to my mind is actually a personal story from my own family. And that is a story that relates to my daughter, who interestingly is now studying to become a computer engineer. Now, when my daughter was young, I think she was somewhere between 4 and 6 years old. She was very, very precocious and curious. One particular day, my wife and I were busy in another part of our house. We were doing a project together, and our daughter was playing kind of very contently in her room. So we were taking that opportunity to kind of task away on a project that we were needing to get done. When all of a sudden, the electricity in the entire house just went out. There was no storm that was happening outside. Immediately, we were wondering, did something go on at a local substation? We were doing some research on the internet. My wife started, trucking through the house to make sure our daughter was okay and found her playing contentedly in her room. After looking at the internet, went to go check the breaker at the electrical panel, and sure enough, it had been tripped. And we found that our daughter was likely up to something, but we couldn't quite figure it out. There was no appliances running. We weren't working with any power tools on the project that we were working on. So we were really stumped at kind of what had transpired that had triggered the breaker to go off. Well, it was later that night when we were getting ready for bed. And at the time in our home, we only had one bathroom that the whole house shared. And my wife has a habit of taking off her jewelry and leaving it kind of in certain places on the counter. And I noticed when we went in there that her ruby ring looked really, really different. It had been sitting on the bathroom counter, and as I looked at it closely, something had marred the inside of the gold band. There were two large gashes that were parallel to one another on the left and the right sides of the ring. We could not fathom what in the world had created them. But what we found out later is that our curious little munchkin had gone into the bathroom while we were busy with our project, and she had been playing with mom's ring, and she wondered what would happen if she slipped the metal parts of the electrical plug into the band of the ring and then plugged it in. Well, as the famous radio broadcaster Paul Harvey said, now you know the rest of the story. What had happened was once she plugged that ring into the electrical outlet, there was an arc of electricity that shot through the ring and damaged the gold along the lines of the electrical plug. My daughter was completely freaked out, set things down, covered her tracks, and then went back to playing in her room. And I share this example because to me, it illustrates so well this quality of Gemini that desires to explore, investigate, and even sometimes dares to do things that might get them into trouble. You've heard that famous saying, curiosity killed the cat. Well, that is definitely appropriate for this decan of Gemini. This is where we see that very mischievous, experimental quality of Mercury, who encourages learning by dabbling in experimental ways. This is also a really good way to actually share one of the major myths around Mercury Hermes that we can learn from about the nature of the planet that rules Gemini. And you'll see this reflected a little bit in some of the graphics that I prepared on this part of the presentation. So shortly after Mercury was born, Mercury Hermes, you'll see me refer to Mercury Hermes in both names throughout the time we're spending together. But shortly after being born, Hermes, as an infant, steals his brother Apollo's mystical cattle. In the process of going about this daring theft, he finds a tortoise grazing in the fields where he moves the cattle to, and he decides to kill the tortoise. He cleans out the shell and then proceeds to create an instrument we know as the lyre. Mercury Hermes stretches oxhide over the shell and then makes strings out of the guts of a sheep and affixes them to a pair of ox horns at the neck of the instrument. Later, when his mischief making is found out, Hermes is brought before his father Zeus by his angry brother Apollo, the sun god, who's demanding justice and is absolutely incensed and wants retribution. Well, what happens next is just absolutely brilliant. Mercury, kind of unfazed by his brother's anger, just begins playing music on the golden lyre that he's created. And all of a sudden, Apollo's attention begins to shift from anger to this beautiful music that's coming from the instrument that Hermes has created. And he becomes totally captivated. Apollo quickly begins forgetting his anger and his grudge, and then proceeds to not only barter with Hermes for forgiveness, Hermes is bartering with Apollo for forgiveness, but then in a flair that is just so mercurial and reflects the charm of Mercury Hermes. Hermes then convinces Apollo to not only forgive him, but in exchange for the golden lyre, he is asks Apollo to grant him gifts of prophecy and divination in exchange for the instrument. It's remarkable to me when I think about this story, the savvy, the charm, the wit, and the cunning of Hermes, who can flip this situation that is completely polarized, and he can completely subdue his brother with music and then not only garner his forgiveness, but also get some really amazing divine gifts in the process. This resourcefulness, this inventiveness, and bartering is deeply enmeshed within the sign of Gemini, and in particular, the archetype of the visioneer. This is where we see the brilliance of Mercury inventing the lyre from the resources around him, creating something novel that is combined of really disparate parts and creates something that really captivates the mind and attention of Apollo. In this same way, the Visioneer, which encompassed things like scientists and artists and inventors, they tap into this same quality of creativity. They see possibilities when different things, which are understood separately as separate components and very individual, are brought together in unique and clever ways. The Visioneer barters knowledge and secrets, patents, if you will, inventions, and creates things that make their way into the world and that characterize this quality of mind, which gets excited about ideas and explores and experiments. One of the things that I think is important to recognize here is that this constant stimulation of thought and ideas and the thirst for knowledge is actually a kind of unrest that when engagement begins to occur around the idea, around the activity of learning, around the activity of experimentation and creation, that unrest is actually exercised and calms down, and it brings things into completion or manifestation. I think that's a very core quality for us to think about and understand about kind of the restlessness that can come with this sign and how important it is for the mind to be exercised. So let's talk about some of the qualities that we would associate with this archetype of the sign of Gemini, the visioneer. So I think of this archetype really capturing the qualities of inquisitiveness, curiosity, a very clear pattern of adaptability and innovation, the ability to see the interrelatedness between essentially unlike things, or perhaps even just unique and separate things. That ability to see possibilities between individual things really culminates in inventiveness by bringing those unique parts together in different ways. And that's not to say that it always works. That's just why this particular archetype of the sign of Gemini experiments until things do work. We also see a very important archetypal journey with this sign and this archetype. This idea of kind of the blank slate of the mind or the innocence of the mind, and going back to the decan, the sign of Gemini that this is associated with, it's that idea of moving from naivety or innocence of the mind to exposure to information, exposure and experience, because there is the knowledge that is learned and understood in a mental way, but there's also a quality of experience that comes through experimenting and applying knowledge. That is very much at the heart of this archetype, the visioneer. We also see this mischievous quality of sometimes not only exploring, but kind of the daring to break the rules. The idea of challenging fixed structures of thought and saying, I see what you're saying here, but I actually have a different opinion. I think we need to transcend that limited way of thinking and break into something new. And so, because of that, there is also this kind of chaos magic kind of quality with the visioneer. All right, next, we are going to talk about the second archetype that I associate with the sign of Gemini, and that's the bard. The bard archetype is a really fun one to explore. In the myths of the twins, we often find within the pairing a twin that represents more of a physical endowment or prowess, the typo there, or an ability that is very physical in nature. And instead, we also have this opposite twin that then kind of captures or represents the artistic, the intelligent, the creative side of the pairing. So let's talk about this subarchetype a little bit more deeply. So part of the bard is diving into this more creative or right-brained side of the nature of Gemini. And if we remember the thema mundi, the signs of Mercury, earthy Virgo, and airy Gemini, they are both kind of complementary in aversion to both the sun and the moon in different ways when we look at them. Gemini possesses this complementary quality to Leo, the fire sign of the sun, but it's an aversion to the watery sign of Cancer, the moon's domain. Similarly, the bard archetype will actually dance between this complementarity and the quirky rebel that spars with words and poetry and can sometimes be very subversive. How many of you know of a poem that really taps into a countercultural kind of thought, or a song that challenges a popular way of thinking or an idea? I mean, we've all followed artists who, for whatever reason, were sort of very counterculture, fringe, if you will. Well, the bard really taps into that, and they tap into things that can sometimes be very subconscious with their art forms. Here is where we begin to see and learn Mercury, Hermes, as the master of the liminal and the in between spaces. So, like the Visioneer, the Bard also is comprised of multiple sub archetypes, which include the entertainer, the comedian, the musician, the actor actress, and the newscaster messenger. The entertainer sees a story in between the mundane circumstances of life and delivers it with new insight and meaning. It shows forth this mercurial quality of finding the meaning in news and in research or in current events and shares those things to illuminate the mind to bring oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting this confused with the newscaster. The entertainer, rather, is one that actually looks at sort of the mundane life and finds kind of like the story that nobody else is seeing. For example, have you ever noticed the way that sometimes people can look at the same piece of art and one person sees a very superficial quality to it, and yet another person will look into it and they will get all of this symbolism and richness and this quality? Well, that's sort of what entertainers do. They see the mundane things of life and they inspire us with these songs or these ideas that somehow explode open something to us that opens our eyes and goes, oh, yeah, there really is all of this depth and meaning there. That is this quality that's very mercurial of finding meaning in the in betweens and the secrets of the in betweens and sharing those to inspire and educate and open the minds of others. The comedian, on the other hand, navigates this same liminal realm, but they tap into the shadow or the taboo and they speak to it very plainly. So if any of you've ever gone to an open mic session, you know, some of the things that comedians do is a part of um, their routines and their practices is they say things that everybody thinks, but nobody has the courage to say. And as a result of that, they tap into that shadow part of our conscious and the taboo, and they interact with it, and it triggers people to laugh. There's this kind of mixture of like, oh my gosh, they're going there, and ha ha ha, and this kind of laughing out of discomfort, but also the laughing because, oh my gosh, I can't believe that they were brazen enough to say that. This is the sacred fool kind of quality where the comedian dares to speak what others only think. And they move past kind of the defenses of the ego and they reach into the innermost sanctuaries of our hearts and minds. This is very reflective of the Hermes Mercury cleverness and the bold charm to invoke those things that we struggle to talk about or even make light of, sometimes very serious things, but they normalize them. They bring them out of the shadow and put it out in the spotlight through mediums like humor and jokes and entertaining monologues. Musicians, on the other hand, tap into the liminal space of creativity by hearing and crafting melodies and words which pull out provocative and felt ideas out of the realm of the subconscious and into being. If you think of that same quality of the whole and the parts, think about the combinations of notes, you know, the true tones, the flats and the sharps, and bringing those together to provide not only entertainment, but to evoke powerful emotions, feelings, to create this environment or ecosystem of sound that works with us and that reaches us, that transcends barriers. It moves between the space of the mind and the heart, the subconscious and the conscious, to evoke feelings and thoughts and memories and otherworldly things. It transports us through their chosen medium, whatever that is, whether it's rock or classical or, Gregorian chanting, even things like that. This is the transcendent traveling Mercury here, who's able to bring different kinds of people on a journey together through music, melody, and song. The actor or the actress, the thespian, adopts a mask and brings to life another character or identity and translates a story out of time that transports us and moves our hearts and minds. I mean, how many times do you sit down to watch a movie or a TV show, or you go to a theater production and you literally feel transported out of your current contemporary time and space into a story? The actor, the actress actually embodies the identity of another and puts on that mask or the disguise, if you will, to embody a particular story or message. Now we can talk a little bit about the newscaster messenger. So the way that this aspect of this sub-archetype of the bard really kind of evokes the mercurial qualities of the sign of Gemini is they share tales from the realm of the unknown to the known. So here again, we see that journey of going from not knowing to knowing, the idea of the light bulb turning on, the awareness being expanded. This aspect of the Gemini Bard archetype is an orator, a sharer of knowledge, enlightening minds to current events and messages from powers and authorities. Mercury, Hermes, was the emissary of the gods. One of the gifts of Apollo was the caduceus, which was the wand that Mercury carried that permitted him to travel the realms. And messenger he was. He would bring messages to other gods in the pantheon, to humanity, announcing news, secrets, judgments, prophecies, you name it. So this is actually a really profound part of the archetype of the bard. And if you think back to medieval times, one of the reasons why I associated the newscaster messenger archetype with the bard is not only were they entertainers and they were often musical or sometimes comedians, but they were storytellers. And oftentimes they brought news from places that were far away when society was less transient. And so we see this kind of embedded in the bigger archetype of the bard, this newscaster messenger quality, where they create awareness. They stimulate thought and action. They provoke the mind. They create awareness through reporting. It's important to note that this sub-archetype can actually include both logical and factual sharing and reporting, as well as the more secret kinds of knowledge sharing, tapping into oracular things like prophecy and divination, and working also with more of the subconscious and ethereal realms of messaging that are very much Mercury Hermes. So let's talk about some of the myths of the bard. There are three here that I'd like to highlight today. We're going to return to the story of Mercury wooing an angry Apollo and securing gifts. We're also going to talk a little bit about the myth of Orpheus and also the parents of Mercury, Zeus and Maya. So, as we return to the myth of Mercury, who is caught red handed with stealing his brother's cattle, but really is unfazed by it, he woos his angry older brother through music. Apollo, who is completely incensed and is rallying his father to deliver justice as the judge, his outrage slowly is calmed and transcended by the music that Mercury's over here not so innocently playing on the lyre. So enamored was Apollo by Mercury's offering that Mercury not only secured that forgiveness that we've talked about, but Apollo then gifted and bartered with Hermes multiple gifts. The caduceus that I just mentioned, which is the wand of authority that gave Hermes safe passage through any realm, that gift kind of was the christening of Mercury as the official messenger of the gods. Apollo also bestowed upon Hermes divine gifts of prophecy, intuitive, and secret knowledge. It's interesting that today we call the study of meaning hermeneutics, which comes from the name Hermes. It's derived from this quality of Mercury Hermes and the understanding of knowledge and things that are visibly seen and observable, and also those things that are more liminal or invisible or only accessed by kind of subjective thought, subjective reasoning, feeling, sometimes even mystical means. This exchange between Mercury and Apollo is deeply symbolic of the magic of the bard archetype and its ability to convert rivalry to kinship through wit, charm, innovation, and artistic power. Through Hermes' music, anger was transmuted into appreciation and exchange. Orpheus is another character in Greek myth who stands out as a mercurial archetype of the bard. Orpheus, in his quest to redeem his wife, Eurydice, I think I said that right, um, has to cross over into the underworld, a domain that no mortal could go into easily. It required special passage. If you think about Mercury, Hermes, he was the only one that really had the ability outside of other gods to transcend the realms. And Orpheus was a mortal. Well, as he begins that journey, he encounters at the threshold of Hades the three-headed giant dog, Cerberus, or Cerberus. I think that's how you say it, Cerberus. Anyways, this monstrous giant dog was known to guard the entrance into the gates of Hades. And Orpheus subdues the beast by playing on the beautiful music or creating beautiful music through the golden lyre, the instrument that Mercury had created. So there's this connection point of this mortal man, Orpheus, who is about ready to cross a threshold which no mortal can cross using an instrument that was invented by Mercury. So the music calms the dog down, it reduces it from being defensive and guarding the gate, and then it calms it down and puts it to sleep. And Orpheus is able to transcend the boundary into the underworld to try and reclaim his wife. It's a really, really interesting story. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about the parentage of Hermes. So Mercury was born of the union of his father Zeus, the sky god, and Maia, who was the daughter of the Titan Atlas. She was the eldest daughter of the Pleiades, a group of sisters, who was the oldest, and she was kind of the archetypal Earth Mother goddess. She dwelt in a cave inside the earth. Zeus represents kind of the air, the mind, the rational or conscious component of Hermes' parentage, and Maya represents the earthy, sensing, subjective, subconscious, the dark quality of the goddess. Are you seeing again here the polarity of light and dark, rational and subjective, conscious, subconscious? That's embedded right here in this story of Hermes' parentage. Mercury, as the child of these two mythical figures, demonstrates and embodies this quality of someone who can navigate and transcend multiple realities. It's why the ancient astrologers called Hermes or Mercury the psychopomp, the guide of souls. He was the one who guided souls after they died into the realm of the afterlife. He was also the one who would bring messages, prophetic ideas, oracles, dreams from the subconscious into conscious reality and awareness. Mercury's ability, Hermes' ability to navigate the world from Olympus to the realm of mortals and also to the realm of the underworld makes him the divine messenger and speaks to the transcendent qualities of the bard archetype's ability to transcend spaces. So it's really powerful us to think about how that is reflected in each of the sub archetypes. I want you to think of a time where maybe you were at a concert and think about being in a diverse audience of people. Think about how each one of those people is individual and unique, and yet within a matter of minutes, through the power of a song, they can be sharing an experience that unites them, that brings them together and makes them feel a part of something that's much bigger than themselves. This is the same power that wooed Apollo and helped him transcend a state of anger into a space where he was willing to not only forgive Mercury, but give him gifts in exchange for the instrument that he'd made. So it's really powerful to think about that in the way that meaning can be brought together through unrelated things, through humor, through storytelling, the music, the arts, and communication. The hermeneutical bard helps us alchemically turn the ordinary into gold and to move from one state to another, to move from darkness to enlightenment. The last thing that I'm going to share about this particular archetype, and I think it's true for many, including the Visioneer, is that the sign of Gemini can be quite improvisational. One of the hallmarks of Gemini is that not only do they have this strategic mind that can create a multi-layered plot, but they have this quality of mind where they can access things that are sort of in liminal places, secret knowledge, ideas, and inspiration, sometimes with sudden clarity. It's like the people who they're listening in on a conversation and all of a sudden something drops in and they have this knowing about it that's very spontaneous, improvisational, but profound. It can almost feel like an unfair quality that they produce something that's so innovative with so little effort. But that is the way that the air sign of Gemini works. It just brings something from the realm of darkness into awareness and light. It is this very innovative quality of Mercury Hermes that shows up in the sign of Gemini that makes us sort of laugh. And I mean, how else could an infant that was just born steal an older brother's cattle and then invent a lyre, an instrument that's quite magical, and then initiates a bargain when they really deserve judgment? This is just the charm and the inventiveness and creativity that we associate with this sign. Well, let's just summarize some of these qualities and character developments that we might associate with the archetype of the bard. Certainly, charm and persuasion, artistic innovation, transcendental messages, and art mediums. I would even add to that creative brilliance, definitely trickster energy, and also this ability to navigate the taboo or the shadowy parts of humanity and human existence, and kind of bringing them into the light and poke at them. There is definitely the magic of meaning, something we call hermeneutics. This also the idea of multiple identities. This taps into the mask or the disguise, um, the putting on a front, um, kind of showing up one way and then secretly moving another direction as a way of maintaining uh, kind of a front or a disguise. There's a little bit of a deceptive quality that can come with this. And that's not always um, like I think it's important that we not characterize Gemini as automatically deceptive. But think about the prowess of an actor who can so perfectly embody a role that they deceive the part of our mind that goes, oh, that's just a regular person. I'm not really watching a show. No, they literally take on the identity of another. Think about Jim Carrey as an example. Think about the way that he would articulate and move his face and his body language to just embody a character that was quite comical. This is what I'm talking about with the embodiment of the mask. Funny that Jim Carrey even played a character called the Mask. Um, Also, the Bard, the quality that we want to talk about is this an idea of again turning on the light bulb, enlightenment, going from darkness to light, kind of a different kind of awakening that comes through art and creative brilliance. Let's transition to our third archetype that we'll be discussing today, which is called the competitor. And I'm going to get a quick drink of water. So, just like we explored early on with the myth of the twins, we now have to revisit the other side of the twin archetype. We've talked about kind of the poet, we've talked about the creative, kind of the right brain side. We also have to remember there's also a very physical side to the sign of Gemini. And since we've explored the bard, now we're going to give consideration to its twin, the athlete competitor. The sign of Gemini is synonymous with the slender, athletic form of youthful vigor. In Greek culture, Mercury Hermes was the god of the gymnasium, where youth were initiated into competitive games and sports. We see examples within the archetype of the competitor of this warrior archetype of Gemini, typically taking on the masculine nature of Mercury's air sign. One of the names of Mercury in Greek culture was Hermes Agonios. This root word, agon or agon, is the word or the root that we derive words from, like agony, protagonist, or antagonist. It implies competition, struggle, and games. And so within the competitor archetype, we find emphasis around things like athletic games and competition, any kind of a game with multiple opponents, the idea of dueling or passing back and forth in motion, and specifically agility, strategic competition, and dexterity over brute strength. There is a quality here within the competitor archetype that emphasizes not only strength that is youthful and nimble, but also a quality of strategy, cunning, the ability to outmaneuver, outwit, and there's a quality of dexterity and athleticism that comes with this archetype. So I want you to think about any sport where there is more than one competitor. Think multiplicity, okay? Think about sports where there might be dueling, where nimble movement and strategy are important, like fencing. Plus, I think it's interesting that fencers wear masks and that it's not only about protection, but there's this mask that they wear. Think about sports like running, where you're running against other competitors in lanes, or even sports like soccer or football for all you non-Americans, or basketball, where there's constant movement back and forth and passage of the ball. Things like tennis and ping pong are also perfect examples of this kind of sending and returning motion that is very synonymous with Mercury Hermes. Let's dive into some of the myths now that kind of undergird this part of the sign of Gemini and the myth of the competitor. Now, there are two that I want to highlight today. One of the primary myths is the myth of Perseus and Medusa, and I'm also going to share about a kind of a contemporary mercurial game that came to my mind as I was preparing for this talk. I want to start by saying that the myth of Medusa is very much rich with meaning and depth. And my goal today is not to address some of the wonderful richness that exists in some of the insightful perspectives that many modern astrologers and thought leaders have brought to this story. Instead, my goal here is to focus on the role that Perseus plays in the story and how that resonates with the archetype of the warrior competitor. Now, in the myth, Perseus was given an impossible quest in order to win the hand of the woman that he loved, Andromeda. This quest involved the beheading of the monster Gorgon Medusa, whose gaze would turn her opponents into stone. In this myth, we see the protagonist Perseus aided by Hermes himself and the daughter of Zeus, Athena, who became the divine sponsors of the young man. Mercury bestows upon Perseus multiple magical gifts and artifacts: an adamantine blade, a cap of invisibility, which would hide him from the Gorgon, and a bag that was magical that could hold the head of Medusa. Athena gifts Perseus a shiny silver shield that he can use the reflective quality of its surface to see Medusa indirectly to avoid being turned into stone. Well, without going into the details of the story, Perseus is successful in his quest. He beheads the monster Medusa, and in his victory does not come through brute force, which we might normally associate with the character of Mars, but his victory comes through tactical and strategic intelligence and the power of reflection. This is archetypally very, very significant because Medusa exists as a type of the shadow in this story, which cannot be overcome. It can't be outmaneuvered directly, but it has to be conquered through reflection. We may not be able to face our fears with brute strength, but we can access our fears indirectly through reflection and mindfulness, understanding and encountering the image in the mirror from a place of protection and safety. In this way, the story of Perseus and Medusa holds the message that we can overcome the paralysis and the terror of the shadow by approaching it with that kind of quality of reflective mindfulness. Many of the myths of Gemini speak of twins that are at war with one another. Example of this include Cain and Abel, Romulus and Remus, Jacob and Esau in the Bible. And instead of being at the war with the shadow, Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, would admonish us that the shadow can't be approached directly without being possessed by it. We must actually approach the shadow through self-examination and reflective work, through looking and considering our dreams, our projections, the things that trigger us in the world, and the symbols that exist. Notably, Perseus wields Medusa's head, and then he turns his opponents to stone following the completion of his quest, which is a picture or a kind of way of saying that he has succeeded not only in the process of approaching the shadow indirectly by looking at the reflection in his shield, but he has actually integrated and is now working with the shadow by holding up the head of Medusa. And that is a picture of making the journey from youthfulness and kind of naivety into working with the shadow as a mature kind of an adult. I think that that's really fascinating. And I think it's one way that we can look at the myth of Perseus and Medusa archetypally that I think is very compelling. And so I hope you've enjoyed that exploration of that myth as well, because I think it really speaks to this quality in the sign of Gemini of where we have to learn to work with the shadow parts of ourselves. And through integration, we can actually um, move into maturity and have advantages. I mean, the head of Medusa was an advantage over Perseus's other opponents. So very, very interesting and compelling story. All right. So here is the other contemporary story that I felt like really fit within this idea of the competitor. Many of you will recognize CBS's modern hit reality show Survivor with its tagline, outwit, outplay, and outlast. It couldn't be a more perfect example of a mercurial contest. This reality show features multiple contestants who play a game of physical and mental challenges. They leverage social strategies, alliances, and daring strategic movers in order to become the sole survivor. Gamesmanship alone can't secure victory here because once you vote everyone else onto the jury, then you have to face the jury. Again, here's that quality of facing the shadow. You have to present an argument to the people that you've played alongside, some of whom are allies and some of them who you've betrayed. And you have to convince them to grant you the $1 million prize. Doesn't this sound you like, doesn't this remind you of the story of Hermes betraying Apollo and stealing his cattle and then convincing him to take the golden lyre and grant him gifts? It's totally a Mercury Hermes story. Well, in looking at the event chart that I cast of the inaugural episode of this famous reality show, the first thing I want to point out to you is that it is a Sagittarius rising chart, which explains the adventurous character of the show and its emphasis on travel to far off places. The show also possesses a powerful seventh house Gemini signature, which includes the Sun in Gemini, Mars in Gemini, and Venus in Gemini. Now, the seventh house was the house of the descendant. It was the place of the setting of the planets. Notably, this show has been a highly popular evening primetime television series for a couple decades now. What's interesting when we begin to break down Mars and Venus in Gemini is that Mars shows this tactical brilliance and strategy, prioritizing the performance of the self and sometimes physically demanding competitions and challenges on the show. And frankly, also this ability to survive, forgive the play to the title of the show, but to survive the harsh conditions that these contestants sometimes face with learning how to subsist with food that they can find around their shelters, limited access to water, no showering, no creature comforts. This is all very, very Mars, centering on the ability to endure suffering and still perform. Venus in Gemini, however, illustrates this show's propensity for showcasing brilliant social alliances, the power of persuasion, charm, convincing others, deceptions and betrayals of the same relationships to obtain this title of sole survivor. You will hear competitors talk about, oh, they played a very physical game, or this person played a very strong social game. You'll even hear players say things like, oh, they did a really good job playing the middle. What does that sound like? It sounds like Mercury Hermes living in the liminal space. So crazy to me how much this show embodies a very Mercury Hermes kind of archetype. The tools of this show are very similar to what we see in the myth and story of Perseus and Medusa. Athletic prowess is required. Alliances with powerful, influential people like Hermes and Athena are key to success. Cunning, self awareness, victory through reflection is essential. You can't convince the survivor jury to give you their vote for the $1 million without your ability to acknowledge your shadow and the ability to recognize and speak to that shadow very well. The orator quality, the ability to create a convincing argument, very Hermes Mercury. Also, there is this obtaining of artifacts and rewards like the immunity idol and other gameplay advantages that create opportunities for success in navigating gameplay. I think it's such a compelling and fantastic example of this idea of the competitor side of Mercury, the very physical, masculine, uh, competitive drive to win, to gain advantages that is reflective of Mercury's more cunning and witty nature. Well, let's now kind of recap on some of the qualities of the competitor in the sign of Gemini and character traits and attributes that we might associate with this archetype. Youthful strength and vigor. I would say athletic prowess and agility and dexterity. Also, I would say there is some quality of mental agility and nimbleness that's associated there. Again, we see this quality of adaptability. It isn't triumph through brute strength, it's triumph by outmaneuvering. Um, it's real time, the fast movement of the mind to adapt to circumstances and to overcome them. It is also this initiation quality of moving from youthfulness to seasoned experience. There is definitely qualities of aspiration and goal orientation and ambition with this archetype, and strategic brilliance, cunning, and trickery. So, really fascinating archetype of the sign of Gemini here with the competitor. And I love the stories. I just get so excited about them. I hope you do too. Well, that leads us to our last and final archetype with the duelist. And it goes without saying that in some ways, this archetype is very much a part of and inextricably related to the other archetypes. But I felt like as I was studying that it still deserved its own place and story. So the very myth of Gemini is rooted in the starry story of the twins. And this symbolism, as we'll discover, is reflected across many cosmologies and cultural stories, such as the Greek myth of Castor and Pollux. I've already mentioned biblical stories of Cain and Abel and Jacob and Esau, and even other indigenous myths and other cultures. And I don't have time to go into all of those today, but if you take some time to do some research, you will see that mythology around twins is actually present in multiple cultures, from Asian cultures to the Middle East, also in other areas and indigenous tribes in South America and in North America. It's really astounding. So it just reminds me that we have to think very globally when we consider the zodiac, because each culture has its own sort of appreciation and stories and myths that they associate with the sky. Let's keep moving. Castor and Pollux were the twins that were born to Zeus and Leda, the queen of Sparta. And so, in the myth of Castor and Pollux, we have to revisit this myth to understand actually some of the depth that exists here. Now, Zeus turned himself into a swan to court the lady of Sparta. The stories actually vary as to whether that union between Zeus and Queen Leda was consensual or forced. But after Zeus slept with Leda, Leda later that night also slept with her husband, the king. And from these two unions, she gave birth to two eggs from which several children emerged. In the first two eggs were Helen of Troy and Pollux, who were associated with Zeus's parentage. In the second of the two eggs, there was another set of twins, Castor and Clytemnestra, who were associated with Tyndareus, the king of Sparta. One set of twins was immortal, the other was mortal. and human. Now, Bernadette Brady, in her book Fixed Stars, notes that Castor was associated with the morning star or the light, and Pollux, the other male twin, was associated with the evening star or the dark. What's really interesting here is you're already seeing polarity in this myth, not only between Castor and Pollux, light and dark, but also we see polarity with each pair of twins had a male component and a female component. Well, as we go on to the myth of Castor and Pollux, unlike other myths where the twins are actually competing with one another or at war with one another, Castor and Pollux actually had a deep affection for one another, and they were actually renowned for how close they were. That closeness ultimately led Pollux, the immortal twin, to redeem his brother Castor, who was eventually slain, and he pled with Zeus. Pollux did. He pled with his father Zeus that he would even give up his own immortality in order that his twin brother Castor might live. Well, Zeus considers this request from his son Pollux, and he grants this boon. And although Pollux did not die in the myth, instead there was context given for the allowance of Castor to return to life. Instead, the twins were permitted to be together for 6 months of the year, spending life in Olympus, and the other 6 months of the year they spent in the underworld, the domain of Hades. So let's think about that for a minute. Here again, what are we seeing? We see Olympus, heavenly ethereal type qualities, and we see the underworld. What does that remind you of? It reminds you of the parentage of Mercury Hermes, Zeus, the sky god, and Maya, the earth mother. We're already seeing incredible symbolism here in the myth and the archetype of the duelist. We can also learn that just like Bernadette Brady talked about in the constellation of Castor and Pollux, one twin was known as the morning star and the other was the evening star. We have the polarity of light and shadow being inextricably linked here. They were two sides of the same coin. Now, we've referenced how some of the twin stories reflect the light and the shadow being at war with one another, as with the story of Cain and Abel, or also you could look at Jacob and Esau in the Bible. At other times, the twins can be quite complementary and endeared towards one another. Again, we're seeing that relationship in the Thema Mundi, where the signs of Mercury were sometimes complementary to one another and to the sun and the moon, and sometimes they were in aversion to the sun and moon. So we have to take with the lesson of the sign of Gemini that we can't become too fixed in our opinions about it, because Mercury in and of himself reflects both relatedness and separateness. And we can see that in things like the separateness and the relatedness between the divine and the mundane, the masculine and the feminine, the ego or the conscious and the subconscious, the mind and the body, that which is visible and easily observable, and that which is secret or invisible or not knowable until it is revealed. Also, concepts like positivity and negatively, good and evil, light and dark. Hermes shows this combination so perfectly as the son of the sky god and the earth mother. He literally embodies the dichotomy and the ability to bridge both sides. And so within the myth of Castor and Pollux, we understand why Mercury rules exchange, dialogue, which the root of dialogue, if we break it down in Latin, literally means two speaking, one person and another exchanging words and listening back and forth. The idea of trade. I think that that's important that we think about polarity and exchange. It's both. Remember that when planets show up in the sign of Gemini, there will inevitably be something about the way that the planet expresses itself in the story arc of an individual. and it will emphasize that same quality of polarity and relatedness and aversion. It will show and explore throughout the lifetime and of that planet and the way that it speaks in that chart of the individual. It will express that polarity in different ways. It will express the relationship between light and shadow and the themes of two and opposites. So, an example is, let's say you have a 10th house Gemini placement. Well, sometimes you will find that people will work two jobs. They might have a day job and a night job, or they might have a day career and a side hustle, or at different times in the life, they will do two things. Maybe it's a role that they hold at work where they're responsible for two different things. I mean, it can show up in so many different fascinating ways. But you will see this when planets show up in the sign of Gemini, that you will see these themes show up at different times and seasons, and it's important to consider that. Now, I'm excited to share with you another myth that kind of comes from the global story place. And again, I just want to offer some real gratitude here to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I hope I'm saying that right, because they have in their culture and myths and stories a very beautiful and compelling story around Sky Woman. And the Sky Woman myth is a cosmology which includes the creation of the world. I'm going to kind of fast forward through that and focus on the story of Sky Woman and her two sons. So, in this myth, which I find very compelling and very fascinating, I just have so much appreciation for, we find the Sky Woman gives birth to two twin boys. They were named Good Spirit and Bad Spirit. Bad Spirit was the second born child, and in the difficulty of his birth, Sky Woman died. And in this story, we see the contrast between the two boys, Good Spirit and Bad Spirit. One goes on to create good things and operate in the light. The other goes on to create darkness and undo the good things that Good Spirit made. I think what's really compelling about this, and again, I feel like it's so important that we recognize that so much learning can come when we set aside our Western mindset. We can often forget that other cultures all around the world have these beautiful cosmologies and ways that they understand the stars, and it's important for us to stay open to that. Well, here we have this amazing perspective from an indigenous tribe to North America. And in this story about Sky Woman and her two sons, Good Spirit and Bad Spirit, we see again the polarity of Gemini expressed. When Sky Woman died, the story goes on to share with us that Good Spirit took his mother's head and hung it in the sky, and it became the sun. Her body he took and he put it in the sky, and it became the moon and the stars. Interesting that we're seeing a picture of the sun and the moon. Remember the thema mundi? The sun and the moon were adjacent to the signs of Mercury, Gemini, and Virgo. And Gemini specifically, and Virgo in its own way, also focuses on the symbolism of light and dark. Here we have Good Spirit who does things with the light, and Bad Spirit that operates in shadow. So wild how this is transcending our understanding of the Gemini sign of the zodiac. Well, the remaining parts of Sky Woman, Good Spirit took and he buried in the earth. So interesting the way that that taps into, the story of Mercury Hermes and his mother, Maya, who was an earth goddess. Well, it's interesting here that in the same way that we understand Gemini, there is a indigenous cultural myth that is mirroring something that we understand from the Greek myths of Castor and Pollux. And I'm excited to dive into that just a little bit more now. Well, following this kind of initiation into the story of the two twins, it says in the tale that Good Spirit went on to create other good things such as trees and deer and bear and other good animals. Bad Spirit would then corrupt and change these giving trees and animals. He gave trees and shrubs thorns, and he actually made certain plants poisonous and certain animals poisonous, creating serpents and lizards that would actually take the life of humans and take the life of the good animals. It was told and said that enmity increased between the two brothers until one day, in frustration, Good Spirit challenged Bad Spirit to a battle, and the winner would rule the world. As the battle unfolded, Good Spirit triumphed in this duel and ultimately banished Bad Spirit to the underworld, to a dark cave underground. And this is where, again, I think there's so much depth and wonder in the symbolism of this myth, because it perfectly reflects something inherent in the sign of Gemini. This idea that somehow the shadow exists as an opposition to the light. It also points out that everything has a dual nature that possesses both light qualities and shadow qualities, and sometimes the shadow can sabotage or pervert the things that the light creates when we fail to work with it productively. Notably, there is this instinct to conquer the shadow or to banish it at the very least, expressing resistance to it. And that's a very human instinct that I think that we all experience. I'd also like to point out that it's really important that when we consider these myths, that we don't associate the dark always with evil. Sometimes very beautiful things come about through the dark. Interestingly, I would also like to point out that science has made incredible study into the ways that poisonous substances from plants and animals interact with the human body, not only negatively, but they can actually be used as tools to stimulate healing. How's that for some Gemini magic? It's deeply reflective of this idea that sometimes we judge things as good or bad, but there can actually be another perspective for the consideration of the quality of something. In this way, we learn both from the benefic and the malefic, that they are deeply related to one another. And so, just like we can appreciate Venus and Jupiter, and that they create things that are pleasurable and good, we also have to acknowledge that the work of Mars and Saturn, who are malefic planets, and they bring difficulty in our lives, that good can actually come from those things as well. And sometimes too much good with Venus and Jupiter can actually be problematic. These polar opposites are meant to exist with one another, and that is deeply integrated into the sign of Gemini and our experience as human beings. So let's wrap up by focusing on the dualist. So the Gemini qualities and character that we might associate with this myth and archetype of the dualist are the inextricable link between light and shadow, opposite natures and characteristics. Sometimes you will see this show up in very real ways, like you'll see a pair of twins and one is very right-handed and the other is left-handed, or a twin that is more quirky and eccentric and one that is more classic and kind of straightforward. Sometimes you'll see a poet and the artist in a more creative orientation or right-brained orientation, and the other will be more of a physical warrior kind of an orientation, more left-brained. Um, and I think that that is really, really interesting when you see the way that this sign mirrors qualities. Um, there's also things like complementarity and aversion, times where this sign can express a contrariness. It can be supportive. It can also detract from things. It can challenge. It can offer a perspective that can sometimes be intentionally divisive. And that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's important to provoke fixed thoughts and patterns and to bring that daring perspective in where we experiment with a new idea. Also within the dualist, we see things like redemption, the integration of the shadow and the benefit of that, and the idea of relatedness and separateness. Now, none of us can really be separated by from our shadow. We're not Peter Pan. Each of us have blind spots that have to be explored and navigated as opposed to being banished. And we can work throughout our lifetime to access these parts of ourselves to achieve that opportunity for complementarity, to overcome that desire to judge the shadow and reject it. Well, how can we apply the archetypes and myths of Gemini in a different way? Some ideas here are, you can look at your own natal chart and determine if you have any planetary placements in Gemini. Maybe you're a Gemini ascendant. If you are, consider that, but also consider where Mercury shows up in your chart as a way that that could be an additional filter to consider for how Mercury shows up. Any planet that does show up in the sign of Gemini, think about that planet's normal significations and think about how that same planet's qualities might be expressed through the archetypes that we've talked through today. It's very, very important to think about that kind of creatively, and it's not always intuitive. Sometimes we have to spend some time thinking about it and walk away, and then you'll find that very naturally those insights will drop in. For example, a Mars in Gemini might be very cunning and nimble as a strategist, might be a scientific kind of inventor, or even an agile athlete. A Venus in Gemini might show up very differently, being very adept socially, moving in different social circles, sometimes very opposite social circles. They might be very passionate about art that features the contrast between light and dark. They might be kind of a relational strategist. So be creative and open-minded with your exploration of these placements. It's really fun, and these archetypes are rich with meaning and symbolism. Well, this concludes our adventure into the myths and archetypes of the zodiac sign of Gemini today. I hope that you've enjoyed it. If today's video inspired you and you want to help understanding your own natal chart, you can go to my website, wisdomtreeastrology.com, and book a reading. Also, for more insights and inspiration to support your spiritual practice, you might consider becoming a member of the Wisdom Tree Patreon, where we have regular audio podcasts, blog style posts with insights for tarot, crystal healing, astrology, so much more. It's very important for me to anchor people in practices that support their journey in this life. And spirituality is a big part of what has made me successful in my life, and I want to empower others in the same way. If you've enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Leave me a comment with your thoughts on this video and give me a follow on Instagram, where I'm actually going to be focusing on some of the archetypes of this sign of Gemini in the life of some famous people here in the next couple of weeks. So don't miss those. Thanks so much for watching.